And welcome to The Shape of Now with me, Basil Valentine. This is the YouTube channel where we investigate how the modern world we all take for granted came to be. This is the second in our fascinating series on the history of air travel. So do please feel free to watch part one, where we looked at how the fantasy of flying machines was turned into reality, until the Wright brothers proved conclusively that machines heavier than air could fly. Few people believed that it was even practically possible. And yet now, in the 21st century, there are about 8,000 aircraft in the air at any one moment, including right now. So in this video, we'll be acknowledging the next key milestones in aviation history and tipping our caps to the men and women who comprised the second generation of aircraft pioneers, the prize winners and record breakers, as well as the people who commercialized air travel and made flying possible for ordinary people all over the world. We'll be exploring the breathtaking speed with which the experimental wooden flyers of the early years of the 20th century turned into long-distance passenger aircraft, and be highlighting the people who brought us the world's first jet-powered flight all the way back in 1952. In the early 1900s, there was fierce competition among both European and American aviation experimenters attempting to replicate the powered, heavier-than-air flight demonstrated by the Wright brothers. Although the Wrights had first flown a powered aircraft in 1903, and by the end of 1905 had flown their Flyer 3 many times, they'd chosen not to make public demonstrations up to that point or allow close examination of their aircraft because, quite understandably, they feared that that might jeopardize their prospects of exploiting their discoveries commercially. As a result, many people simply refused to believe the claims of the Wright brothers until Wilbur's demonstrations at Le Mans in France during August of 1908, when their mastery of airplane control was obviously apparent. That in turn set off a mad scramble amongst their peers in Europe to emulate the feat. Aircraft construction companies suddenly mushroomed, and numerous prizes were offered for milestone achievements. One such inventor was Frenchman Gabriel Voisin, who, together with his brother Charles, set up aircraft company Les Frères Voisin. They sold an aircraft to a Monsieur Henri Farman, an Edwardian gentleman pioneer of motor racing, and on January the 13th, 1908, he won the coveted 50,000 francs Deutsche de la Meurthe Archdeacon Grand Prix de l'Aviation for being the first aviator to complete an officially observed 1 kilometer closed circuit flight, including takeoff and landing under the aircraft's own power. This confirmed that European-built machines could steer and turn with intent, thereby making the Voisin biplane Europe's first successful powered aircraft. It was also in 1908 that Wilbur Wright carried Charles Furness as a passenger, marking the first time a powered aircraft had carried more than its pilot. At the time, few, if any, of those watching from the ground could have had any idea what that particular development meant for the future. Progress then continued to move with extraordinary speed. The Daily Mail owner, Lord Northcliffe, had befriended the now celebrity Wilbur Wright during his sensational 1908 public demonstrations, and so, with one eye on publicity for his newspaper, he offered a prize of £500 to anyone successfully completing a flight across the English Channel before the end of the year. Northcliffe hoped Wilbur Wright would win the prize, but with Orville back in the United States recuperating from serious injuries he had sustained in an earlier crash and therefore unable to assist his brother, the Wrights withdrew from the contest. When 1908 passed with no serious attempt being made, Northcliffe renewed the offer for the year of 1909, but doubled the prize money to £1,000. The cynics, however, were still out in force, with the French newspaper Le Matin declaring that there was no chance at all of the prize being won. After all, it's a long way from a 1 kilometre flight to the 32 kilometres sustained flight needed to cross the Channel. However, in early June 1909, a French national of English extraction, Hubert Latham, flew another type of aircraft, an Antoinette Mark IV monoplane, and in doing so broke the world record for flight time by remaining in the air for an astonishing 67 minutes. A week later, he won another prize, the Prix Goupil, by flying a 6-kilometre straight course in the fastest time. But it was the cross-channel prize that really captured the public's imagination. This was the era of those magnificent men in their flying machines. After his prize-winning exploits, the favourite for the prize was, quite understandably, Hubert Latham, with his chief rival being Louis Blériot, who intended to fly across the Channel in his Type 11 monoplane. Also having a go were French-Russian aristocrat Charles de Lambert and Englishman Arthur Seymour, one of Wilbur Wright's star pupils, but Seymour withdrew after his aircraft experienced regular engine trouble. Latham arrived first in Calais in early July, and he set up his base at Sangatte in semi-derelict buildings originally constructed for another revolutionary way to cross the Channel that would finally be realised decades later: digging a tunnel. 10,000 fascinated spectators gathered at Calais, with a similar number assembled at Dover, and the wireless Marconi company set up a special radio link for the occasion. Windy weather forced Latham to postpone for several days before he finally set off on July the 19th. The heroic Latham could almost see the cliffs of Dover when, just 6 miles from his destination, his aircraft developed engine trouble and he was forced to make the world's first emergency landing of an aircraft in the sea. It was a magnificent failure, and Latham was rescued by the French warship Harpon and taken back to France, where he was greeted with the news that Louis Blériot was on his way to Calais. Blériot, accompanied by 2 mechanics and his friend Alfred Leblanc, arrived in Calais on Wednesday, the 21st of July, and set up their base at a farm near the beach at Les Baraques. The following day, a replacement aircraft for Latham was delivered by the Antoinette factory, but the wind was too strong for either man to attempt a crossing either that day or on the Saturday. But on Saturday night, the wind began to drop, raising hopes in both camps. And so, at 4:15 in the morning, on the 25th of July, watched by a very excited crowd, a bleary-eyed Blériot made a short trial flight in his Type 11 monoplane, and then, on a signal that the sun had risen, the competition rules stating that the flight had to take place between sunrise and sunset, he took off at just after 20 to 5 in the morning to attempt the crossing. Blériot had no compass and took his course from the destroyer, the Escopette, which was accompanying him, but he soon overtook the ship and carried on, flying blind in deteriorating visibility, saying later, "For more than 10 minutes, I was completely alone, isolated, lost in the midst of an immense sea, and I did not see anything on the horizon or even a single ship." Just then, the grey line of the English coast came into sight on his left, but the wind had increased and blown him to the east of his intended course. Altering course, he followed the line of the coast about a mile offshore until he spotted Monsieur Charles Fontaine, the correspondent from the very same Le Matin newspaper, waving the French flag, the tricolour, as a signal. Blériot hadn't visited Dover to find a suitable spot to land, so with local advice, Fontaine picked a patch of gently sloping land called North Fall Meadow, close to Dover Castle, right on top of the White Cliffs. Once over land, Blériot circled twice to lose height and cut his engine at an altitude of 20 meters, making a heavy pancake landing due to the gusty wind conditions. The undercarriage was damaged and one blade of the propeller was shattered, but Blériot was unhurt and he had succeeded. The flight had taken 36.5 minutes. News of Blériot's departure had been sent by radio to Dover, but he was expected to land on the beach to the west of the town. The Daily Mail correspondent, realizing that Blériot had landed near the castle, set off at express speed in his motor car and took Blériot to the harbour, where he was reunited with his wife. The couple were immediately surrounded by a cheering crowd of press, public and photographers. Blériot had become the latest aviation celebrity. The first cross-channel flight proved to be a watershed. For the first time, an ocean had been crossed by aircraft in controlled navigation from one significant point to another. People realized that flight could link places in a way that no railway, train or vehicle had ever done before. It was a symbolic tearing up of geography. And at the time, no regulations, no agreed rules, and there were no aviation authorities. 1909 turned out indeed to be an absolutely pivotal year. August that year saw the world's first international air meeting, the Grande Semaine d'Aviation de la Champagne, an event that marked a defining moment for aviation. Sponsored by champagne makers and attended by the celebrities and dignitaries of the day, record-breaking flights, competitions, and large crowds helped establish aviation as both a viable technology and entertainment. The American Glenn Curtis's prize-winning Junebug beat Blériot to the most coveted prize, the Gordon Bennett Aviation Trophy, a time trial with competitors taking off separately, but Blériot did succeed in winning the prize for the fastest single lap of the circuit, establishing a new world speed record for aircraft. The event showed that improved reliability and speed were achievable, with each success nudging the technology away from novelty and towards genuine practicality. That same month of August 1909 also saw the opening of the world's first airport. College Park Airport was established by the United States Army Signal Corps to serve as a training location where Wilbur Wright himself taught Lieutenants Frederick Humphreys and Frank Lamb how to fly. Humphreys then became the first military pilot to fly solo in a government airplane, while on October the 27th that year, Mrs. Ralph Henry Van Denman was flown by Wilbur Wright to become the first woman to fly in a powered aircraft in the United States. College Field is still open today and is, of course, the world's oldest continuously operated airport. Nevertheless, aviation operations in these early years remained rudimentary, with pilots improvising, grass fields serving as runways, and launching systems were invariably hand-built contraptions. But by the end of 1909, something fundamental had irrevocably changed. The world now had aircraft that could take off, steer in the air, navigate between points, complete reliable circuits, and land with enough control to fly again. Powered flight had become repeatable, and the world had its first airport. The essentials of modern aviation were in place. Public demonstrations and lively press coverage turned initial public skepticism into fascination. For many onlookers, seeing these machines rise into the air felt like a turning point in what modernity might mean. Once the idea of controlled flight was proven, the question was no longer whether humans could fly. It became how far, how fast, and how safely they could go. And the next era would answer those questions with astonishing speed. When the new decade opened, flight was still a daring pursuit rather than a dependable technology. Aircraft were fragile, engines unreliable, and pilots often depended on luck, every bit as much as skill. Yet, underneath all that uncertainty, the world was already beginning to stretch the limits of what flight could do. In 1910, another series of breakthroughs hinted at what was coming. Louis Paulhan won the London to Manchester air race, flying through the night and showing that long-distance flight over populated routes was not only possible, but captivating to the public. And in another sign of the age, Paulhan also exceeded 100 miles an hour for the first time. For aircraft still held together by wooden spars and wires, this was a remarkable speed. Henri Fabre then completed the first successful seaplane flight that same year, proving that the sea could become a runway. And then came two feats by Eugene Ely that opened an entirely new frontier. He took off from a ship's deck in 1910 and landed on the deck of another ship. These brief moments contained the beginning of naval aviation. They offered a glimpse of a world where fleets could carry aircraft far beyond the shoreline. At the same time, Galbraith Perry Rogers completed the first continent-crossing flight of the United States. The journey was rough and required many stops and repairs, but it demonstrated endurance and ambition on a scale never seen before. Just 3 years later, and another milestone was marked, and one with huge ramifications. It was the world's first scheduled passenger service, an airboat piloted by Tony Janus, which set off from St. Petersburg in Florida and landed at Tampa, around 17 miles away. The service only ran for 4 months, but it had unlocked the appetite of those keen to tap into the novelty of air transport. These developments were hugely significant because they showed what aircraft could become. The ensuing First World War would take these hints and turn them into reality at extraordinary speed. When conflict broke out in 1914, most countries possessed only small aviation units. Their tasks were simple and cautious: reconnaissance, artillery spotting, keeping an eye on troop movements. But combat experience changed everything. It soon became clear that having the ability to see from above could shape battles. Very quickly, improvised machines were replaced by purpose-built fighters and then bombers. The German Fokker Eindecker introduced a synchronized machine gun that could fire through the propeller arc, transforming air combat and forcing rivals to catch up. Allied governments responded with immense procurement programs. Factories expanded and new manufacturers emerged. In Britain, firms like Sopwith and the Royal Aircraft Factory grew very rapidly, while in France, SPAD and Nieuport gained reputations for the speed and agility of their aircraft. Germany, too, invested in its Fokker and other designs. Aviation was no longer an experiment. It was becoming an industry. Meanwhile, pilot training also changed just as dramatically. The small pre-war flying schools gave way to formal programs that taught navigation, formation flying, gunnery, and cooperation with ground forces. Pilots were no longer lone pioneers. They became members of structured air services with clearly defined roles. By 1916, aircraft diversity had exploded. Bombers, fighters, reconnaissance craft, and specialist machines appeared on every front. Engine power grew quickly, allowing higher altitudes and longer ranges. Airframes were strengthened, multi-engine bombers entered service, and for the first, but not the last time, strategic bombing emerged as a military tactic as nations began to imagine the terrifying and devastating impact air power could achieve. One curious outcome of the war was the surplus it created. Thousands of aircraft, trained pilots, engines, and factories now existed. They would soon spill into the civilian world and shape the next phase of flight. The Curtiss JN-4, known as Jenny, that had been used to train American pilots, gave barnstorming air demonstrations and made flight a familiar sight to ordinary people after the war. Public demonstrations and bold press coverage played their part. People saw pilots as heroes and aircraft as symbols of progress. The wartime necessity had turned the aeroplane from a delicate machine into something nations now depended upon. What had once been a fragile experiment was now a fully industrialized endeavor. Speed, range, reliability, and organization all moved forward together, and the stage was set for commercial aviation to emerge. When the guns fell silent in 1918, the world was left with an unexpected inheritance. There were trained pilots by the thousand, airfields scattered across continents, factories capable of producing engines and airframes, and a public fascinated by the idea of flight. The key question now was how to turn all this military momentum into something useful in peacetime. The answer began with a moment of pure ambition. In 1919, Alcock and Brown completed the first non-stop transatlantic flight. Their crossing showed that even the vast ocean, which had always separated nations, could itself be spanned by air. It was far from a practical passenger route, but symbolically it changed everything. It became an anchor for the new era, signaling that aviation could link continents as well as towns. In the years that followed, governments and entrepreneurs started to build the earliest national and short international airline routes. What had once been improvised wartime service were replaced with planned networks. Just imagine watching this unfold if you lived in a major city at the time. Aircraft that had once been tools of war were suddenly landing at local airfields with mail, cargo, and even paying passengers. These early services depended heavily on state support. In Europe and North America, governments offered postal contracts and subsidies to keep the fledgling airlines afloat. Passenger numbers remained small and revenues were uncertain, but carrying the mail provided a stable financial backbone and gave the airlines a reason to expand. And so after the invention of aircraft in the 1900s and both the expansion and technological advancements in the 1910s, as the 1920s approached, a new era was on the horizon. The United Kingdom established the Department of Civil Aviation in 1919 to manage emerging civil flying, and on August the 25th the same year, the first scheduled timetabled flights between London and Hounslow Heath and Le Bourget in Paris began, launched by Aircraft Travel and Transport Limited, a forerunner of British Airways. Thus was established the world's first daily international passenger air service. These pioneering flights used Handley Page aircraft and marked the start of regular commercial air travel between two capital cities, thereby laying the foundation for the intercontinental travel of today. Mass fascination among the public with flying took off alongside the development of new innovative technological models. Indeed, the 1920s marked the beginning of what many historians call the golden age of flight. It may not have been as technologically advanced as today, but it marked an era of unprecedented enthusiasm for aviation. People were fascinated by air races and feats of daring carried out by star pilots like Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh. More and more companies started developing sleek monoplanes in accordance with advances in aerodynamics, with biplanes becoming the exception and increasingly obsolete, although wood and fabric were still widespread until the 1930s. The main fabrication material had switched to metal. Milestones continued to fall at regular intervals throughout the 1920s, providing newspapers with headlines and the public with heroes. In 1922, Just 14 years after Wilbur Wright's legendary demonstrations, the first non-stop transcontinental flight of the United States took place, when US Army Air Service pilots Oakley Kelly and John McCready flew coast to coast in a Fokker T-2 in under 28 hours. In 1924, two Douglas World Cruisers, named the Chicago and the New Orleans, completed the first flight around the world. The journey started and ended in Seattle, covering over 27,000 miles and taking 175 days with no fewer than 74 stops. But it meant that nowhere on Earth was too remote to be reached by air. In 1925, the Contract Mail Act allowed the American Post Office to contract mail carriage to private companies, and this decision changed the direction of American aviation, while the Air Commerce Act of the following year became the cornerstone of US federal government's regulation of civil aviation. This landmark legislation was passed at the urgings of the aviation industry, whose leaders believed that the airplanes of the day could not reach their full commercial potential without federal action to improve and maintain safety standards. The Act charged the Secretary of Commerce with fostering air travel, issuing and enforcing air traffic rules, licensing pilots, certifying aircraft, establishing airways and runways, and operating and maintaining aids to navigation. For the first time, flying was governed by rules designed to protect both pilots and the general public. And while these steps may seem obvious to us today, at the time they were very bold. They showed that aviation was becoming integral to national infrastructure. Public excitement then reached fever pitch on May the 21st, 1927, when Charles Lindbergh made the first non-stop flight from New York to Paris, a distance of some 3,600 miles. Flying alone for more than 33 hours, it was an event that captivated the world and gave a huge boost to public confidence in aviation. His aircraft, the Spirit of St. Louis, won the $25,000 Orteig Prize for the first flight between the two cities, and although not the first transatlantic flight, it was both the first solo crossing of the Atlantic and the longest at the time by nearly 2,000 miles, setting a new distance world record in the process. The achievement garnered Lindbergh worldwide fame, and it stands as one of the most consequential flights in history, signaling a new era of air transportation between different parts of the globe. Although air flying was still accessible only to the very wealthiest people and was hardly comfortable due to heavy wind turbulence, noise, and low cabin temperatures, it still meant demand for civilian-only aircraft increased. Breakthrough aircraft of the era include the Ford Trimotor, introduced by the Ford Motor Company in 1928, which made air travel potentially profitable for the first time by carrying up to 15 passengers. It connected American coasts, earning it the accolade of the first widely successful passenger aircraft in America, while the German Junkers G31 also carried up to 15 people, and its robust multi-engine design helped establish major European services. And of course, we must give special mention to the Handley Page W8, which was not only one of the first British airliners designed for civilian usage, but also, crucially, it was the first aircraft to have an onboard bathroom. Passengers on these early flights were welcome, but numbers were still small and fares high, with the air freight filling the gaps. US mail contracts for agreed routes encouraged reliability, with the new companies expected to meet timetables, use only approved equipment, and maintain set performance standards. While federal subsidies produced a stable framework that would support rapid growth in the following decade, so the idea of the airline as a disciplined operator rather than just a daring pioneer began to take shape. The beginning of the next decade and 1930 proved to be another year of stunning milestones. Amy Johnson became the first woman to fly solo from England to Australia. Sir Frank Whittle patented the first jet turbine design, thus initiating the path to the high-speed jets we fly in today. And almost as important for today's passengers, Ellen Church became the first airline stewardess. Yes, the very first flight attendant was for Boeing and Boeing Air Transport, and it was, of course, the first taste of luxury in the sky. Meanwhile, aircraft design continued to improve apace. In 1933, Boeing announced their 247, the first all-metal twin-engined airliner, and it set new standards for speed and comfort. It was one of the first such aircraft to incorporate advances such as all-metal semi-monocoque construction, a fully cantilevered wing, and retractable landing gear. And so the modern aircraft was born, and the question was no longer whether an aircraft could fly or fly between two cities. It was how far it could go, how fast it could go, how reliably it could perform, and who might be able to travel on board. The 1930s was the decade when the whole world began to realize that long-distance air travel was destined to reshape global connections and communications. Emergent airlines such as Pan American Airways, Imperial Airways, Air France, KLM, and Lufthansa took the lead. They created scheduled intercontinental services linking Europe, the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Australia. In the era before jets, the preferred mode was huge flying boats. And these mobile hotels revolutionized long-distance travel, offering luxurious, large-scale air transport across the oceans long before land airports were common. Iconic models like Pan Am's Boeing 314 Clipper and Britain's Short Empire featured plush cabins, dining rooms, and sleeper berths for transatlantic and trans-Pacific journeys. Connecting remote parts of the world in style and speed, it was a truly unique moment in the history of travel, with these services combining the glamour of the ocean liner with the speed of modern engineering, and the ability to land on water offered a kind of freedom that paved one-ways had not yet matched. But the land-based planes were improving rapidly, and navigation had become a crucial discipline of its own. Pilots relied on radio direction finding and celestial navigation, using sectants to maintain course over vast featureless oceans. It was very skilled, demanding work, where one small error could cause an aircraft to stray far from its intended path. But for many crews, that challenge was part of the appeal. Then, in the mid-1930s, we saw the arrival of the Douglas DC-2 and the DC-3. These aircraft completely changed public expectations. Fast, efficient, and capable of multi-stop transcontinental routes, they made commercial travel more viable than it had ever been before. A typical Douglas DC-3 could cruise at around 300 kilometers per hour, fly more than 2,400 kilometers, and carry about 28 passengers. For the first time, a land plane offered performance that matched the ambitions of the airlines. The Dakota, as it was affectionately known, became one of the world's great workhorse aircraft, and of the 16,000 odd that were built, around 150 are still in use today. Unlike the multi-skilled pilots of today, though, who have a wealth of electronic equipment to help them, the long-distance flyers of the 1930s were reliant on multi-member crews, with pilots, navigators, and radio operators all playing a part in keeping the aircraft in the sky and on course. The workload had to be shared because navigation and communication were still a long, long way from being automated. Every long-distance journey was a coordinated effort across air and ground, with meteorological support absolutely crucial. But as the weather data improved, it meant airlines could plan night flights and maintain schedules with far greater predictability. Aircraft strength, range, and engine reliability all improved rapidly in the interwar years, so that compared with the machines of the 1920s, the aircraft of the mid-1930s were able to carry much heavier payloads and fly non-stop over much greater distances. This meant routes could be designed with fewer stops, reducing cost, journey times, and vastly expanding the reach of civil aviation. Most of the passengers at this time were, of course, wealthy individuals or lucky government officials, with the cost of long-distance tickets placing air travel far beyond the reach of most people. Mail and priority cargo usually filled up the remaining space on board, but even if only a few people could afford to fly, the social and cultural impact was much, much wider. Newspapers followed each new route. Radio broadcasts highlighted the idea of a shrinking world, and for many people, flying became the best symbol of modernity, even if they never stepped aboard an aircraft themselves. The experience in the 1930s shaped aviation for decades afterwards. Airlines continued to refine their approaches to route planning, navigation, and crew training, and governments understood that long-distance aviation had great strategic value. So they invested in technical innovation and infrastructure, preparing a world where continents might be connected by air as easily as by sea. The era ended with a sense of momentum. Aircraft were now strong enough, fast enough, and reliable enough to cross oceans and link nations in ways that had once seemed impossible. The foundations for global air travel had been laid. Yet the next big transformation would come not from commerce, but from war. When the Second World War began, the major powers rapidly reorganized their economies around the aircraft industry. Hangars filled, assembly lines multiplied, and governments treated aviation not as an experiment, but as an essential tool of national survival. Aviation production expanded on an unprecedented scale, pushing technology, logistics, and organizational systems far beyond anything imagined in peacetime. Back in 1935, Sir Robert Watson Watt had proposed using radio waves to detect aircraft, and together with his assistant Arnold Wilkins, they demonstrated this by bouncing signals off a bomber. The chain home system they developed was the very first network of radar stations. Operational by 1938, chain home became crucial for spotting incoming German planes and was one of the most important wartime advances. Radar absolutely transformed air traffic control by enabling controllers to monitor aircraft movements in real time beyond the limits of radio communication or visual range. For the first time, aircraft locations and altitudes could be tracked precisely, drastically improving safety and coordination. By the mid-1940s, radar systems were operating at key airports in the United States, offering a decisive advantage over earlier visual-based control methods. This marked the beginning of a new era in air traffic management, one in which precise tracking became the foundation of both safety and efficiency. By the final years of the war, aircraft technology and production capacity had reached a level unimaginable in 1939. World War II also created habits of global coordination. Operations relied on shared navigation systems, internationally standardized procedures, and structured communications. Meteorological services expanded, radio networks spread across continents, surplus bombers and transport planes were everywhere, and as had happened after the First World War, there was now an abundance of trained personnel, engines, airframes, and infrastructure. Many of these military aircraft were repurposed for civilian use, thus becoming the backbone of the emergent network of commercial airlines and giving commercial flight a powerful running start. By the late 1940s, air travel had evolved from a promising technology into a fully industrialized global system. The world found itself sitting atop an aviation network that was bigger, faster, and more capable than anything previously conceived, with the machines, expertise, and infrastructure to build something entirely new in peacetime, something that would reshape how people moved, worked, and even imagined distance. Aircraft had crossed oceans on supply missions with daily regularity, and navigation equipment had improved out of all recognition because it had to. Long paved runways were by now commonplace, so the question became how to turn this immense military-backed machine back towards civilian life. And so wartime transport planes were converted to carry passengers and cargo. Available in large numbers and at minimal cost, they allowed airlines to expand rapidly without immediately designing new fleets. The trained aircrew also entered the civilian arena, bringing with them habits of discipline, standardization, and the technical skills forged under wartime pressure. It wasn't long before governments and manufacturers were pushing beyond simple aircraft conversions, developing new all-metal airliners designed specifically for commercial service, stronger, more efficient, and capable of flying further and faster than any pre-war aircraft. One of the most important breakthroughs of this area was, of course, cabin pressurization, which allowed aircraft to fly at much higher altitudes, above most of the weather that had plagued earlier flights. A landmark example was the Boeing Model 307 Stratoliner. Derived from the B-17 Flying Fortress, this four-engine stressed skin airliner became the first aircraft in revenue service with a pressurized cabin, a cabin that we would recognize today as being essentially the same in layout and presentation as those of our contemporary jets. Combined with supercharged engines, the Stratoliner could cruise above the weather at 20,000 feet, reaching speeds of 220 miles an hour and offering just a glimpse of what post-war air travel was destined to become. The Stratoliner was quickly followed by the Lockheed Constellation, which became the defining aircraft of this transitional era, offering tremendous comfort and reliability. On the 19th of April 1944, the second production Constellation, piloted by the billionaire playboy Howard Hughes and Trans World Airlines President Jack Fry, flew from Burbank in California to Washington, D.C. in just under 7 hours, an absolutely extraordinary achievement at the time. On the return journey, the aircraft stopped at Wright Field to give aviation pioneer Orville Wright his final airplane flight, more than 40 years after his first. Wright briefly took the controls and remarked that the Constellation's wingspan alone exceeded the distance of his original flight. Orville reflected with mixed emotions on the part played by aviation in wartime. He regretted the destruction wrought by bombers and compared flight to fire, a powerful invention capable of terrible harm, yet inevitable and essential to human progress when put to constructive use. Throughout the late 1940s and 50s, airports were built or expanded and quickly repurposed for civilian use. Their long paved runways, lighting systems, and maintenance hangars allowed large aircraft to operate reliably. In the late 1940s, passengers arriving at these new terminals must have felt like they were stepping into a brave new world shaped by both industrial might and the modern optimism of the mid-20th century. Civil aviation also needed structure. International conventions were established after the war with rules for airspace use, safety certification, and scheduled services. Licensing crews, inspecting aircraft, investigating accidents, all these things together formed the measures that became the backbone of modern aviation. The idea of a managed sky began to take shape, and state airlines expanded rapidly, inheriting routes that often began as military or imperial connections. Private carriers also grew, though many relied on government support during the transition. Safety and reliability replaced raw performance as primary goals, as airlines sought aircraft that could depart on time, fly efficiently, and deliver predictable journeys, just as they do today. For many passengers, the experience was exciting and futuristic. Entering a pressurized cabin and rising smoothly above the clouds meant a new relationship with distance. Journeys that had taken weeks by sea and land could now be completed in a few days. And by the early 1950s, aviation had reached a turning point. The aircraft of the late 1940s were capable and well organized, but they remained bound by the limits of piston and propeller propulsion. Flights were still long, noisy by today's standards, and physically very demanding. The world was waiting for something faster, something that matched the confidence of the new technological age. That moment arrived on the 2nd of May 1952, when BOAC launched the world's first scheduled commercial jet service using the de Havilland Comet 1. The Comet could cruise at 720 kilometers per hour, about twice the speed of contemporary propeller-driven airliners, and flew high above most weather disturbances. Its pressurized cabin carried 36 passengers in unprecedented comfort, with reduced noise, lower vibration, and smoother flight profiles. It lifted off with a smoothness unfamiliar to passengers accustomed to vibration and engine roar, and its inaugural route from London to Johannesburg was the first permanent jet aircraft scheduled service, and so the jet age was born. The British Overseas Aircraft Company promoted the Comet as the beginning of a modern global network, and the claims were justified. Travel times fell dramatically. London to Tokyo dropped to around 36 hours, compared with more than 86 previously. Distance itself seemed to shrink. The Comet was a bold engineering leap, de Havilland integrating turbojet engines into a civil airframe at a time when jets had previously been exclusively used for military purposes. The physical demands placed on the aircraft of flying so high and so fast required new thinking about structure, metal fatigue, and aerodynamics. Early setbacks led to refinement and redesign, culminating in the Comet 4. Its transatlantic service started in 1958 and did a lot to restore confidence and set standards that influenced later aircraft such as the Boeing 707 and Douglas DC. But the jet age brought more than speed. It introduced predictability, global connection, and modern airports. Routes crisscrossed continents in the patterns we use today. Flying was no longer extraordinary, it was completely normal. In just 50 years, the fragile wooden and paper machines had been transformed into a worldwide systems of high technology, ultra-fast jets. The world learned to live in the sky, and distance was no object, no longer measured in weeks or days, but in hours. I'm Basil Valentine, and if you've enjoyed this perambulation through the utterly compelling story of the evolution of air travel, then do please like and subscribe to our channel. Feel free to watch part 1 of this series, and I look forward to seeing you in the next chapter, where we'll be bringing the story right up to date, looking at everything from budget airlines to supersonic flight, and asking what happens next in the ever-evolving story of mankind's conquest of the skies.